Welcome to the third Thursday Environmental Series, program of free online events organized by representatives of the towns of Rochester, Marbletown, Rosendale, Gardner, and Olive here in the mid-Hudson Valley. Each month, every third Thursday, we present a free online presentation from a local authority on an environmental topic. They are recorded and shown on our YouTube channel. Past topics include permaculture, fungi, birds, forestry, local farmers, foraging, etc. And tonight we have Pollinator Gardens Made Easy with Avalon Bunge, who will show us how important pollinators are to a healthy ecosystem, explain how we can support threatened pollinators, and basically tell us everything we need to know about planting an ecologically balanced native garden. Avalon oversees pollinatehv.org and the Ecological Restoration Grant program. Prior to that, she directed a coastal climate resilience education initiative through NOAA's environmental literacy program. Avalon received an MS in ecosystem restoration from SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry and a BA in geology from Colgate University. Before we get started, we'll take questions at the end, and you can type them into the chat or raise your hand and ask them yourself. And without any further ado, take it away, Avalon.
Great. Thanks so much, John and Casey and Alan and everyone else for being here. I'm going to go ahead and share among my many windows here. All right. Everybody should be seeing some slides. Thumbs up. Good. Excellent. So I'm not sure who called this talk Pollinator Gardens Made Easy. That might have been me in a moment of hubris, or it might have been the fine folks from the third Thursday series. I will tell you as much as I possibly can in 35 to 45 minutes about pollinator gardens specific to the native plants and native pollinators of the Hudson Valley. But of course, this is a whole vast world and there is so much more to know and to learn. And luckily, I'm supported in this talk by this Pollinate HV resource, which I'm going to tell you a little bit about and just say up front that I hope you'll all check it out because it's got a lot more information than I could possibly pack into a talk, really of any length. So as John mentioned, my name is Avalon. I'm from Partners for Climate Action. I'm going to just quickly mention my organization and the Pollinate HV resource. I want to take you through a little bit of background on the Hudson Valley's at-risk pollinators and what it means to be an at-risk pollinator. Then we'll talk about some of my favorite native plants and native planting sort of strategies for your garden. And then we'll kind of zoom out from there to a few habitat management tips for when you are planting a native focused garden. And hopefully we're going to have lots of time for Q&A. I will get really distracted if I start answering questions halfway or partway through, but please bombard me with your questions at the end. And if we don't get through them all, I absolutely welcome you to email me and we can keep the conversation going and I'll have my contact and everything at the end. Okay, so Partners for Climate Action, just quick intro to my organization. I am the Ecological Projects Manager here. Our mission is to catalyze bioregional climate action, and that should really say climate and ecological action because we have a pretty robust ecological project portfolio, which I'm going to share more about. If anyone wants to check us out, you can go to climateactionhv.org. But then our sister website and sort of the project of my heart is Pollinate HV. And this is a project that was conceived by one of our founders and executed by a whole wonderful team of people, really from 2021 up through now. So several years of work by scientists, by land managers, by pollinator and plant experts, designers all throughout the Hudson Valley. And this is this, if I say it myself, pretty cool resource, pollinatehv.org, which will show you kind of soup to nuts, everything you might want to know about planting native for the threatened pollinators of the Hudson Valley. Everything from learning the background up to planning for your project, preparing your site, installing a project, and then managing into the future, which is really important, as you probably all know if you're gardeners and farmers and permaculture folks in the room. So I just want to give you a little bit of background to Pollinate HV, and I absolutely welcome you to go ahead and type that URL in as I'm talking about this. You're welcome to ask me questions that you draw either from my talk or from the website if you do end up cruising around there in real time. Pollinate HV is a fully online resource, and it really revolves around the pollinators. So we started by selecting a list of about 195 threatened, vulnerable, declining toward extinction pollinator species, and that includes bees, butterflies, and moths. And I'm going to talk about why it includes only those taxa. So we started by figuring out what are the pollinators that are native to this area that are the most threatened by sort of the polycrisis of ecological threats that we work with right now. Then we figured out, again, with the help of many excellent scientists, what are the native plants that are the most important partners for those threatened pollinators. And then we worked with a landscape designer to put those native plants into landscape designs. And then we worked with some really excellent Hudson Valley landscape managers and private and public landowners to install some of those landscape designs. And all of this is documented at pollinatehv.org, where you'll find a whole bunch of background about why we should care about threatened pollinators, why we should care about native plants, why the Hudson Valley is such a special place for all of this. Then kind of the meat of Pollinate HV is our how-to guide, which again is that everything from planning up through management. One of my favorite parts of this resource is the case study section. So that's all of the installed landscape designs. We documented them with specific budgets, with labor costs and sources and material sources, and what local nurseries did they use, and how much did their plants cost, and how many volunteers did it take, how many hours to get all those plants in the ground, really to try to give a picture of what does it look like to get this work done here in the Hudson Valley. And then just for extra, we have some resources, some of our favorite native plant books and apps and ID tools, and we also have a pretty extensive nursery list, as well as, of course, our native plant suggested list, which I'm going to cover in much more detail. So I want to start by kind of diving into that background section of Pollinate HV and just giving a bit of background on the at-risk pollinators of the Hudson Valley, but even more than that, pollinators broadly. So who are the pollinators? So when I give this talk or similar talks in person, I often ask if anyone has been a pollinator, and very often a lot of hands go up in a room like this because folks have pollinated their squash plants that they're breeding in their backyard, or they've hand-pollinated corn in a little small patch with a paintbrush. And you can absolutely be a pollinator. I recommend it. It's fun. A pollinator is anything that assists in plant reproduction by transferring pollen from flower to flower. And it is kind of a staggeringly vast slice of the animal kingdom that can fall into this category. So bats can be pollinators, wasps, the middle up center top here, flies can be pollinators. A lot of the spring ephemerals that we're going to start seeing hopefully very soon, like our trilliums and wild ginger, are actually fly pollinated. Beetles can also be pollinators. I don't have a picture of a beetle. Birds, I'm sure we've all seen hummingbirds attracted to beautiful red flowers for their nectar. They're also doing pollination. Humans, of course, can be pollinators. And I just added this bottom right one. I don't know if anybody was following along, but I think it was last November, scientists discovered that this wolf is actually functioning as a pollinator. This is the Ethiopian red wolf pollinating the red hot poker flower. And what it wants is to eat the nectar, but incidentally, it's also collecting pollen on its snout and assisting in the reproduction of that very cool plant. So all that is to say there's a lot that we still don't know about our pollinators, and the pollinators that we do know the most about mostly fall into these three categories. And these are our bees, butterflies, and our moths. So the native plants and the kind of planting techniques that I'm going to talk about tonight are mostly focused on supporting these three taxa, the bees, butterflies, and moths. But what we expect is that the more we can cultivate biodiversity, the more we can get native plants back on the landscape where they belong, the more we're going to support all types of pollinators on the landscape, even insects or animals that we might not even have identified to science yet, which is pretty cool. So I'll just quickly mention who's on this slide, because these are all pollinators that are target pollinators within Pollinate HV. Let's see, we'll start with the big obvious one. The monarch butterfly is definitely one of our threatened, endangered, vulnerable pollinators that's native here in the Hudson Valley. It's migratory, but it is considered to be native here on its migratory route. One of my favorite butterflies, bottom middle. I don't know if anyone has been up to the Albany Pine Barrens, but the time is coming for the Lupine Festival in May when all the lupines are in bloom. And that is also the time when the Carner blue butterfly hatches or comes out of its pupation and flutters around the beautiful pine barrens. And this is one of our, I think, really flagship insects of the Hudson Valley. It's restricted now to this really specific habitat in the pine bush because it's a specialist on that plant, native wild lupine, which is really only still found in those sandy, fire-maintained pine barrens. So really worth a trip up to the pine bush to check these little guys out. We've got some bees on our list. We have the golden northern bumblebee, Bombus fervidus, which is really beautiful and huge. I've seen one once. Like many bumblebees, it's ground nesting. We'll talk about ground nesting bees and how to support them. We've got the blueberry cellophane bee, that's its real name, and I'll come back to it later as well. And then we have moth pollinators. So if you have white flowers in your garden, fragrant flowers, night blooming flowers, it's a good bet that you have moth pollinated flowers. They're actually excellent pollinators, and they are one of the groups that science is still learning a lot about. So the beautiful waved ash sphinx moth is just one of our threatened moth pollinators here in the Hudson Valley. So threatened, what does it mean? There was this wonderful, but not wonderfully publicized study, a multi-year effort by the New York Natural Heritage Program called the Empire State Native Pollinator Survey that was published, I believe, in 2022. And it's like this 400-page report on hundreds upon hundreds of different species of bees, butterflies, and moths across the whole state of New York. And the big takeaway is this: up to 60% of our native pollinator species are going to become extinct if something isn't done to bolster and support their populations. And so that's really bad news. But the good news, which I'll share here and then kind of keep coming back to every slide through the rest of this presentation, is that there's actually a lot we can do at the home garden scale to support these threatened populations. And really all it takes is getting the right native plants into our landscapes. And then we have native plants and we have beautiful gardens. Everyone's happy. So before I talk about how to do that, I do have to give a caveat about who I'm not going to talk about tonight, and that is the European honeybee, or the Eurasian honeybee, or indeed any honeybee, because none of them are native. We find that the honeybee is the recipient of one of the best executed and most sort of misguided conservation campaigns probably ever. So a lot of us, I grew up hearing Save the Bees and thinking, great, we'll save the honeybees, and colony collapse disorder is this terrible thing. And certainly beekeepers have a lot to contend with to keep their hives healthy. But us as native gardeners, we are not concerned with supporting the honeybee because it has no role in a healthy native ecosystem anywhere in North America, except to compete with and actually cause problems for the native insects that we do want to support. And you can say, but they're such important pollinators. They're actually not the world's best pollinators. We actually find that a lot of our native bees do a better job at pollination services than imported honeybees do. And we find there was actually just a study that I saw just came out in Science yesterday. We're getting more and more conclusive evidence that when honeybees are present in a system, native bees cannot thrive to their fullest potential. And they find this because there are islands where honeybees are kept. And then when honeybees are removed from the island, then you have this sort of closed system where you can study what happens. And what happens is when the honeybees leave, the native bees are finally able to make use of the resources and sort of stabilize their population. That's the last thing I'm going to say about honeybees. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about what is bugging our native insects and what we can do about it. So there's a lot of threats out there. I mentioned this idea of the polycrisis, lots of interwoven, intertwined, wicked problems threatening not just our pollinators, but our entire ecology. But when we talk about pollinators, we often think about these two things: pesticides and habitat loss. I like to mention pesticides because I actually get to share good news about pesticides in New York. You might be aware of the Birds and Bees Protection Act, which was passed in 2023. Is it already 2 years old? I'll have to check the year. It was either last winter or the winter before, and it's a really exciting New York State policy that's going to phase out neonicotinoids, so the most toxic and widely used class of pesticides that harm not only agricultural insects, but of course, every other insect that might be on the landscape or downwind of those major sprays. So it looks like we might have some good news around pesticides. We are still contending with a lot of issues around habitat loss. So I count all of these systems as lost habitat. Lawn, we like to call green concrete. It provides no benefit except maybe water infiltration to the ecosystem and really no wildlife benefit at all. It's often also a pesticide and fertilizer sink and a source of pollution. So I'm sure we've all heard about kind of the kill your lawn movement. And I think that's a great thing. We should all be having less lawn. We've lost a lot of our native habitat to agriculture, and certainly we have to eat, but there are ways that can be done much better. We can do our farming practices with a lot more pollinator benefit in mind. So monocrop agriculture would not be one of those ways. And then we've got the deer problem. So at Partners for Climate Action, we also have a forest health task force where we think a lot about the lack of regeneration in New York State forests, really the imminent collapse of our forests. And the main driver of that is actually deer overabundance. Deer are so overpopulated on the landscape that they're eating every baby tree before it can turn into a big, healthy forest-grown tree. They're also targeting the very same native plants that these pollinators need for their pollen and their nectar and their forage services. So we have too many deer. They're a native species. They're adapted to eat native plants, and they're actually helping to kind of pull the rug out from pollinators. So that's another aspect of this issue that it's worth thinking about, especially if you're a larger land manager. I can come back to the deer thing later, but we'll talk mostly about how we can get plants on the landscape from here. So native pollinators, again, not including honeybees, need native plants. These are the plants that these insects evolved with. They're the plants that they feed from. They collect pollen, nectar, and they also use them as host plants. So the Lepidoptera, the butterflies and moths that I mentioned earlier, have, of course, a caterpillar life stage. And those caterpillars, many of them, are highly specialized to only be able to eat leaves from certain genera, or even species of plants. And actually, the king of the host plants, the king of the caterpillar supporters, is considered to be this middle guy here, this oak tree. Supports something like 450 unique species of caterpillars in the Northeast, and more like 1,000 if you expand that to the United States. So there are some really important plants that it's important to cultivate. How do we do it? I love that question. Let's talk about it. So I want to first talk about pollinate HV here. We have lists upon lists of plants for every possible site type, or probably not every possible site type, but many site types that you might encounter. We've got a plant list that looks kind of like this for full sun gardens, for shady gardens. We've got dry shade, which is, I know, such a tough garden characteristic to be working with. We've got a plant list for moist areas and for pond edges. Pond edges are actually one of the most important insect and wildlife habitats around, one of the best that you could have on your landscape. So first thing to do if you have a pond is stop mowing right down to the edge. And second thing is to start to fill in that edge buffer zone with some of these pollinator-friendly native plants. Urban landscapes can really do a lot to support pollinators, and so we have a plant list for those. Everybody likes to know about ground covers, although it was pointed out to me recently that every plant technically is a ground cover because it covers the ground. But you know what I mean, short, spreading, kind of low maintenance plants. We've got shrubs and trees, and those are some really important pollinator powerhouses, which I'll get to again in a minute. And then if you're interested in specialists, so these insects that cannot survive without the presence of a certain plant, the monarch butterfly being the classic specialist. It can't survive on the landscape unless its caterpillars have milkweed to eat. But there's lots of other butterflies in similar boats with different plants, and then there's also bees that need special or singular species of plants if they're going to be able to collect pollen and thrive. So we have different lists for those. We also have a much larger list that you can download, and I hope you will. It looks intimidating here just because it's shrunk down so far, but it's just a spreadsheet. And here we have the plants on the left-hand side, and you can see each plant name is blue. They're linked out to their plant profile in the New York Flora Atlas. So you can click on each one and see photos of the plant, what kind of habitat it likes. Then you can see just some kind of basic garden information. So this is bloom time from early to late. We've got how much sun does it like, what kind of soil moisture does it like, and then over here we have what are its pollinator associations. But how that looks, because I know you can't read this, is suppose you wanted to know what black cohosh, Ecpia racemosa is black cohosh, what kind of pollinators does black cohosh support? You would start with your plant in the row, and you would simply follow the row over until you hit a colored box in the pollinator section. And then you would read that up until you hit the name of the pollinator, which in this case is the Appalachian azure, which is a beautiful butterfly declining in the Hudson Valley. And then you would say, great, I can plant some black cohosh if I want to support this Appalachian azure. You can also read it backwards. You can start with an interesting pollinator that you want to know what it needs, read down to its colored box, and then over to what plant that pollinator likes. And many or most of these plants support multiple pollinators in our list. So there's lots of ways to get a good amount of bang for your buck there. So I could list all 160 plants, but I feel it would not be the use of everyone's time, the best use. So I want to kind of zoom out to some general native planting principles. And my first one of those, especially if you're working in a small space and you want to, again, maximize that bang for your buck, is to plant for specialists, because generalists will then also be able to use those. So here on this slide, I have 3 examples of beautiful native plants with their specialist insects. We talked a little bit earlier about the Carner blue butterfly, and this is Lupinus perennis, the native wild lupine. So the caterpillars of the Carner blue can only eat the lupine leaf. So if you have the lupine on the landscape, though, you'll also get other bumblebees, other nectaring butterflies, lots of other pollinators will be able to make use of that, but you'll also be sure that you are supporting the one pollinator that can only make use of that plant. So it's kind of the best way to feed everybody. Milkweed, again, a classic. The caterpillars of the monarch can only eat milkweed, but in this picture, as we can see, we have a bumblebee foraging on the milkweed flower as well. This plant can support lots and lots of different insects, as well as its main vulnerable and endangered specialist. And then we have the blueberry cellophane bee, which is a pollen specialist. You can see it's all covered in pollen here on the blueberry plant. And some folks are not aware that blueberries are in fact native to this region. And not only are they native, but they are one of the most important early spring pollen sources for a lot of our small native bees, including the specialists. So we'll talk about some more shrubs in a second here. But we'll also talk about bloom season. So that's why it's nice to give this talk in March, or if you're watching on the recording, whatever time you're listening is also a good time. But we are closing in on, true spring and things really starting to bloom. And really, as soon as it starts to get warm outside, insects start flying. And if they're flying, they're foraging. They need food on the landscape. I've already been seeing bees, not just honeybees, as well as flies and some early emerging insects in my yard. And I want to make sure that they have plenty of resources to get them through that kind of emergent, just woke up from winter hibernation. What do I do now? So here are just a few good examples. I usually don't label my flower slides, but I forgot the name of a plant the other day and I was horrified, so I had to go and put labels on everything. I did use the scientific name. If you want the common name, you're welcome to take a screenshot of this and then just you can always Google the plant name that you want, but I'll also mention them. So Acer, that is our maples. This is actually down in the bottom left, a red maple flower. And it is one of the earliest and one of the best pollen sources for our early foraging bees, and even for some of the very earliest moths as well. So if we've got maples on our landscape, we are supporting pollinators, even though we don't think of them as like the showy kind of garden perennial flowers that we might be more used to. Although they are really beautiful up close, and it's not just the red maple, but as well the sugar maples and the silver maples and all of our native maples. I will add, when I'm looking at this slide, if it says SPP, that just means species. So it means any plant within this genus is a good option. Very important caveat to that is you want to stay native. So there are, of course, like invasive Norway maples, which we don't want to be encouraging, or there are invasive willows or non-native kind of ornamental willows that we don't want. We want to stick to the native versions. With that, willows are an incredibly important early season pollen source. You can see all the pollen hanging off of this pussy willow bud situation. They're great for the earliest emerging bumblebees. Super easy to propagate. You can just take some cuttings, stick them in water, they'll root, and you can have lots of willows all over your landscape. The caveat with the willows is that if you want the pollen, you have to have a male plant. So how do you know if you have a male plant? Most nurseries won't be able to tell you. That's why it's really good to go out actually at this time of year and just see which willows have pollen on them and then do the cutting and propagating thing. You know you have a willow. Blueberries, I've just mentioned, but they are excellent early pollen sources. Violets, the violets in our yard, in most cases, I think there's one introduced violet that's getting more widespread, but there's at least like 8 or 9 native violets in the Hudson Valley, all of which are fantastic nectar sources for some of the first butterflies of spring, which will happen a little bit later. We're not quite the butterfly season yet. And then I just love to mention these two. This is Pachyra aurea and Zizia aurea. So the species name of both means golden aurea. And they are both really lovely kind of matrix plants for filling in around larger plants in your garden. They're both kind of short, and they are just pollinator powerhouses. They'll bloom early in the spring, and then they'll sort of give way to the larger, more kind of classic perennials of the full season. That's the early season. We also want to attend to the late season. And this is one of my gardens, so this can kind of give you an idea of what kind of chaotic pollinator focused gardener I am. But in my defense, I think this was September, and we've mostly given up by September on keeping things neat anyway. But the fact that it's September shows you that there's still a lot that's blooming in the fall. And for us in the Hudson Valley, it really is a case of the asters and the goldenrods. Those are going to be our biggest pollinator powerhouses for the late season. And here we have, this is Solidago speciosa in the middle here, which is showy goldenrod. There are, I believe, 33 native goldenrods in our area. So if you are a little bit put off by goldenrod and you're like, but it takes over the fields and I don't know if I really want it in my garden, is it going to be a bully? That goldenrod that you're thinking of, you definitely don't want in your garden. That's Canada goldenrod. And it is definitely aggressive and much more of like a field spreader. But there's a goldenrod for every situation, including shade, including forest gardens. There's blue stem and zigzag goldenrod, as well as a beautiful tall plant called silverrod. So there's golden, but also silverrod. And I really encourage you to get to know the goldenrod. If you just want like one for the border, it's this one, Solidago speciosa, showy goldenrod, lives up to its name. Huge, plump, yellow spikes, always covered in bees. And then we have our asters, which go with the goldenrods like peanut butter and jelly. They are meant to be together on the landscape. Here, I think we have New England aster as the purple one, and this might be white panicled aster, which is the white one. But there's also, I think, well more than a dozen native asters. Asters are a little bit scarcer on the larger landscape than goldenrods because asters are really deer candy. They're one of the native plant species that the deer just love to snack on. And so the fact that we have this deer overpopulation means we're losing some of that fall bloom that's so important to pollinators. So just to keep that connection made. Yeah, so I wanted to mention the early spring and the late fall, not just because it's generally good to have a long bloom season in your garden, but because when we're thinking about our gardens as part of a larger landscape, we sometimes like to think about kind of plugging in to what isn't already abundant and kind of making our yards like shoring up the existing biodiversity and filling the gaps. So there's often a gap in the early season and in the late season because folks are mowing or just not thinking about, flower gardening really early and really late. So that's a great way to be a really supportive pollinator gardener and also, of course, extend your garden season. That being said, there are many, many wonderful options for summertime. I am going to just mention, I'm not going to go through each of these plants, but if you want to know about any of them, you can ask me at the end. They're all beautiful. I recommend all of them wholeheartedly for a garden situation. I will say, actually, I will mention something. These two on the left here are both milkweed. So this is butterfly milkweed, Asclepias tuberosa, the orange one, and then we have rose or swamp milkweed, Asclepias incarnata. I don't like to recommend common milkweed, which was the one I showed before with the big, beautiful globe-like flowers for a garden situation because it is a bully. There are some native plants that will just like push into everything. That being said, it's sometimes nice to know what those plants are, because if you have an area that you want to be low maintenance and you don't want to, fuss with, and you just want to stick something there and know that it's going to take care of itself, there's native options for that situation too. And a good one of those would be common milkweed. But these are my two garden favorites. The orange one would be for a dry garden, and the pink one would be for a wet garden. So the main point I want to make with this slide is that we are prioritizing local natives. So every plant that I'm showing you on this slideshow is from the Pollinate HV list. They're native to the Hudson Valley, and we know that they support the most threatened, most vulnerable bees, butterflies, and moths. They're not necessarily the quote unquote pollinator plants that we're most used to seeing. So notable absences would be coneflower, Echinacea, purpurea, and black-eyed Susan, Rudbeckia. And those are like two of the most common pollinator plants again in quotes, that you'll see at any nursery. And it's like, yay, these are for the pollinators. What those actually are is prairie species that have made their way east through a very interesting sort of ecological history, but they're not necessarily the best adapted plants to support the native pollinators to this area. And so we want to really be focusing on our local natives, and that includes everything on the Pollinate HV list. If anybody wants to talk about climate migration of plants later on, we can kind of get into that, but not a lot is known yet about how plants are going to shift in response to climate change, so I am still continuing to recommend historically locally native species as the best option for biodiversity and resilience. Okay, so those were just some examples of plants. This one was actually on the previous slide. This is white spirea at a beautiful conservation area near where I live. And I like to use this as an example of massing your plants. So I'm not a designer, and I'm not able to tell you exactly how to design perfectly for your space. But I will recommend that when you're planting specifically to support pollinators, you want to think of having at least 3 to 5 individuals of any given species. And that's because you want to be able to support, you want to give a full meal to each pollinator that's coming. And you want to have those plants kind of clustered up together so that a pollinator is not expending a lot of its finite energy kind of zooming back and forth around your yard trying to find the species that it needs. And that's also a good way of imitating nature's design, because as you can see, plants like to kind of grow in these drifts or these clusters, and it's a really nice way of kind of naturalizing your landscape while still supporting pollinators. So it's better to pick a few species to add to your garden, or to start a new garden with a few early, middle, and late season species, rather than to kind of try to get one of everything right off the bat. That's my idea here. That being said, there's a couple of other whole classes of plants. So far, I've focused on perennials, which are wonderful. There's also native grasses and sedges. And what do these have to do with pollinators? They are host plants. So this grass that's being collected by the seed collector here is little bluestem. Many of you might be familiar with it. And it's actually the host plant for some really gorgeous endangered skipper butterflies. So the caterpillars of those butterflies require this grass for that stage of their life cycle. And we can incorporate native grasses as well as sedges, which look like grasses but aren't quite grasses, right? Botanists crazy, into our gardens, kind of as a matrix or a fill between some of the drifts of flowering perennials. And I love incorporating native grasses and sedges in the garden. On the other end of the size spectrum, I guess, we have our woody plants. And this is a case of, if you only want to plant one thing, or you don't really want to like start a whole new garden and again be fussy about it, but you'd like to get something on the landscape to support pollinators, I highly, highly recommend a woody plant, and that means a native tree or a native shrub. And there are many of these that kind of do it all. They provide early season pollen and nectar. They are gorgeous. They're, flowering ornamentals. They're also often host plants, not just pollen and nectar sources, but caterpillar food to boot. And then many of them also make fruit for people, for birds, or for a combination of both, depending upon who gets there first. So just a few examples of my favorites. Again, we have that pussy willow. It's a great native shrub to have anywhere it's wet. If you have a dry site and you still want a willow, there are native willows that will suit you. There is the prairie willow and the meadow willow, both of which are not riparian species and will do really well in like a yard setting. We have also serviceberries. I think some folks might have foraged or know about the serviceberry. It's a wonderful tree, amazing pollinator plant. Similar but different genus is the native plum genus. So this is Prunus americana, the American plum. Also chokeberry is in that same genus and category of pollinator benefit. Winterberry is a great host plant, and then again, a great food plant for birds and beautiful winter interest. And then the humble rhododendron, a lot of people don't know, but if you live in an older house or you have, a shady side of your house and you have rhododendrons there, it's almost a sure thing that you have the native rhododendron, Rhododendron maximum, which is a really important early season pollen source for native pollinators. They're well adapted to it. It's so common and it's been so urbanized that sometimes people just batch it in with all the other ornamentals, but it is actually a native ornamental. And there are beautiful native azaleas in that same category as well. Okay, so I'm not a designer, but we hired a designer to take the Pollinate HV plant list and create some garden templates, which are going to be coming out this spring. This is a preview of one. They're going to be kind of graphic design massaged and prettied up a little bit. The original landscape designs that we had within Pollinate HV were sort of more larger scale landscapes. And we had a lot of feedback that those were great, but how about something for a residential scale? Like what about a front yard border or something along my walkway or just a little patch in the back? So we've got, I believe, 10 of these coming. This is just an example, a sunny low border for kind of average soil. We've got dry shade coming. We've got a pond edge design. So definitely be on that climateactionhv.org email list if you want to be notified when these come out. And that should be soon. So they'll have the design. They'll also have a gridded version so that you can take it out into the field and plant according to it. And then they'll also have a bloom schedule that kind of shows you how things will progress over the course of the season. So this one's got a phlox, got that lupine, it's got penstemon, some milkweeds, baptisias, beautiful grasses in the summer, and then of course it's got asters and goldenrods in the fall. Kind of that full season buffet. Okay, how am I doing? Not bad. I want to go offer you, sort of as my last chunk here, a few larger scale habitat, native habitat cultivation tips and tricks. And so let's just mention a couple of those. The first one is, where am I going to get all these plants? Well, you need a native nursery. We definitely don't want to be going to the big box stores to get these native plants, because even if we could find them, which most of the time we can't, even if we could find them, they are almost certainly treated with pesticides, even the ones that are marked pollinator friendly. Xerxes did a big study on this and found that like every single plant that they tested, the coneflowers and the black-eyed Susans, were pesticide laden at those big box stores. So we have a native nursery list on Pollinate HV. There are some amazing options coming up in the Hudson Valley. And when you go to your nursery, I just want to mention this idea because sometimes it comes up from the more garden focused folks. So a cultivar is just any version of a plant that's been bred by humans to have specific characteristics. And sometimes we say blanket statement, no cultivars in native gardening. We only want the plants that are as close to their wild versions as we can possibly get. I generally subscribe to that rule with one exception. So here we have two different types of cultivars, cultivated versions of wild plant species. One of them is okay with me and the other one is not. So which is which? So this one on the left, the white flowers on the green leaves, that one's fine because that's a size cultivar. So to a pollinator, this plant looks almost the same as it would in the wild. The flowers are the same shape, they're the same color, they bloom at the same time. All that's different is instead of making a really big shrub, this one makes a small shrub. So a pollinator is still going to be able to recognize that and get what it needs. On the right here, we have an echinacea cultivar with all these extra petals. And sometimes people think this is a zinnia. It's not. It's actually a coneflower that's been bred to look totally different. So already we can tell a pollinator is not really going to recognize that as the species that it's looking for. And even if it did recognize it, it would be out of luck because this plant was bred to have all these extra petals at the expense of its cone center, its pollen-bearing center. So this is actually a sterile cultivar with no pollen whatsoever and nothing to offer pollinators. So we definitely want to steer clear of any plants that have been bred to look very different than they might in the wild. And I will submit that native plants are plenty beautiful, just as they are, and they don't need to be turned into these strange fluffy pink things. So just a note about cultivars and straight species. Straight species is the wild type version. That's what you want to be seeking. You can even go one better or one farther than that and seek out local ecotype plants. And these are plants that have been propagated from local genetics. And those are often plants that are the best adapted to support local pollinators because those pollinator genetics and those plant genetics have evolved in the same place over the same time scale. The bloom time and the pollinator emergence are going to be really well synchronized. You know, the flower shape and the pollinator shape are going to be a really good match. So, and it's also a really good way of supporting native plants themselves, which are also worthy of conservation, although not the focus of this talk. So this is a great way of stewarding our local wild plant genetics, as well as making sure we're having the best plants out there for the pollinators. If you check out the native nursery list in Pollinate HV, the nurseries that offer local ecotype plants are marked. You can also check out this link right here, bit.ly/pollhv, and that's the local ecotype seed collection that we've partnered with Hudson Valley Seed Company to develop. So there's going to be, I think, a total of 18 or 20 species coming online over the next couple of years that are all seeds from local wild genetics that are species of the Pollinate HV pollinator plant. So highly recommend that you check that out and just kind of pop this idea of local ecotype into your gardening bucket. Okay. So a couple of last thoughts just about managing your garden as a whole. There are certainly some native plants that like soil fertility, but most of the prairie type or like meadow type species, the goldenrods, the asters, most of the beautiful perennials that I showed, don't want so much soil fertility. So we don't need to be out there dumping compost on our native garden. And we certainly don't want to be consistently covering the ground with deep woody mulch. And that's both for the plant's benefit and for the bees' benefit. So 70% of our native bees, including many of the pollinators on that threatened list, are ground nesting. This doesn't mean that we need huge expanses of bare soil, but it means that we do need some little gaps of bare soil in between our plants. And that means rethinking a little bit the sort of deep mulch that some of us may have, I was taught to use. What do we have instead of mulch? More plants. So we want to have the plants sort of fill in the areas where it might have otherwise been a plant, and then a big patch of nothing much but mulch, and then another plant. And that really means kind of rethinking the way we design our gardens, which again is not my expertise, but we'll have some examples to show in just a couple short weeks here. Okay, if 70% of bees are ground nesting, what about the other 30%? Well, those are cavity nesters, and that means that we need to have dead wood and standing stems within our gardens. So cavity nesting bees will be going into hollow stems of native plants to hibernate for the winter, or they'll be going into wood cavities in something like this, which is a snag. So it's great to cultivate all of those things within our garden. It's also, as I'm sure you've heard, it's great to leave the leaves. But if you haven't heard why it's great to leave the leaves, it's actually because we have native butterflies that hibernate as adults under those piles of fallen leaves. So just as an example, this one in the upper left is the mourning cloak. Mourning as in grief, because it's kind of dark and dramatic looking. And it hibernates over the winter in this form right here under your piles of fallen leaves. And it has been shown to survive winter temperatures of up to minus 70 degrees under that protective leaf blanket. But if it doesn't have the leaf blanket, it's not going to survive the winter, and we're going to lose that butterfly. And this study actually just came out a few weeks ago and showed that removing leaves can reduce the abundance and the diversity of Lepidoptera, butterflies and moths in particular, by almost half. So we definitely want to be having at least some leaf piles in our yards over the winter. I've kind of already mentioned this about creating a four-season landscape. This is just that idea of leaving standing stems within your garden until much later than you would like to. My husband right now is like, when are you going to clean up the garden? And I'm like, it's coming, but it's not quite there. You have to wait until temps are, I would say, consistently springy. So like nights in the high 40s to the 50s consistently, and sunny, nice days. That's when everybody is going to have emerged from their stems and gone on their merry way. Bonus to this is that all these seed heads are also great winter bird food. So that's really a four-season wildlife landscape. Okay, I think this might be my last or next to last slide. And I just want to mention a little bit about managing a native landscape. I have sort of this idea of the three W's: weed, water, and watch. Sometimes people say, oh, native plants, they're so easy. You just set them and forget them. You don't have to do anything about them. Well, not quite. Um, we still deal with invasive species in this area. We deal with deer pressure. There's always going to be some plants that you put in your garden that just aren't going to thrive where you put them. And especially when they're young, and especially if you're planting small plants like plugs, they do want to be weeded for like at least the first year or two, so that they can really kind of get a foothold. And a good way of doing less weeding is to plant more plants, because then the plants will really kind of weave together into this blanket of greenery and won't allow a lot of weeds to germinate in between them. Then watering, same deal. We often hear, oh, native plants, they're so drought tolerant. Very often they are, but especially in that first season, again, we just want to make sure that they get a good established foothold. And very often that means like an inch of water per week, same as you would think of as a fruit tree. So long, infrequent soaks, better than short, frequent sprinklings. And that'll encourage those really good native plant roots to go deep. And that will create drought tolerance in the future. And then watch. It's a pleasure to watch, see what pollinators come around. But also, no two sites are alike. And when those garden designs come out, if every person here planted that sunny border that I showed, probably everybody would have a slightly different result. There's always going to be something that does so well, you get a little scared and you're like, maybe I need to put this somewhere else. And there's going to be something that just really doesn't want to grow where you have it. And that's totally fine. This doesn't have to be a really rigid design proposition. This is really just about getting to know your site and what thrives there, and stewarding the biodiversity that you can on the place where you are. So I have a whole other talk about meadows, seeded meadows, wildflower meadows. This one included black-eyed Susans. So I shouldn't have it in here because I said not use black-eyed Susans. But if you're interested in converting a lawn to a seeded wildflower meadow or converting an old agriculture field, highly recommend checking out Pollinate HV for that, as well as just so much more than this kind of quick and intensive info dump that I have given you. I will share my contact information, as well as the Pollinate HV website and the Climate Action HV website, and our social media. So there's no Pollinate HV social media, but it's just combined with the Climate Action social media. Hope that you'll follow us there and sign up for our newsletter here. We're going to have some walks. We're going to have some meadow tours in various locations of the Hudson Valley, as well as forest health walks and workshops. So the way to find out about those is to be on our mailing list or to check us out on social media if you want to see all this work in the real world. Many of our tours will in fact be going to the Pollinate HV case study sites. If you get intrigued by the photos on the website, you want to sort of see where are they now, we invite you to come out and join us and see what's happening this season. And let's see, yeah, and this is my email. So I'm going to take questions, but if we don't get to everything, or if you want to have a deeper conversation, I welcome your emails anytime. And the contact form on this site also goes directly to my email. So you can always find me. And thank you so much.
Thanks, Avalon. That was great. That's a lot of information. I recommend everybody go to YouTube in a couple of days and watch this again and take notes, take more notes. That's great. We can open this up for questions. I have one quick question. So we can clean up our garden beds when a certain temperature. Would it be safe to say that we could do that when we see bees out?
Yeah, that's a good rule of thumb. I would say like when you see consistently bees out, not just like one bee.
Hmm.
So
Okay.
it's really tough. It's like, well, how about the second week of April? How about, I'm not sure I have the exact
Yeah,
perfect knowledge of when spring happens and when the best garden cleanup is. But yeah, basically as spring gets more advanced and insects are flying around, then we can do our garden cleanup.
great. Any questions? You can either unmute yourself and ask, or you can raise your hand and I'll call on you.
And while folks are thinking of them, I'll look at the ones in the chat.
Oh, yeah.
Someone says they saw their first cellophane bee this morning, which is amazing. I think there is an unequal cellophane bee. There's some absolutely crazy names out there. There's like, um, oh gosh, there's the group of the cuckoo nomad bees. So there's like the beautiful cuckoo nomad bee, and then there's the depressed cuckoo nomad bee. And you're like, really? But um, it might have been your bee, an unequal cellophane bee. Yes, there are good plants to help the cellophane bee. I'm going to refer you to the Pollinate HV list because I don't have them off the top of my head, but that's a place where you would want to look at that spreadsheet that I showed, and you can just Command F search for cellophane bee, and then you can look down its column to see what plants it's matched with. Somebody asked me about Rudbeckia laciniata. I think it might be native here. My favorite source, I'll look it up in real time while I'm taking other questions, is the New York Flora Atlas. There's also BONAP, the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, and then Go Botany. I do have a native nursery friend who grows Rudbeckia laciniata. Yeah, I was mostly talking about Hirta and then a little bit Triloba there. So good call, who called me on the Latin names. And I'll get back to you about laciniata.
I was kind of surprised about the echinacea because it gets so much action, you know.
Mhm. Yeah, so it can be a good plant for the garden, and I have it in my garden. It's just not necessarily the plant that's best associated with some of the threatened species. It's also a really good nectar plant. So if you see a lot of butterflies on it, you're like, oh, it's getting a lot of action. That's great. But a lot of butterflies are generalists as adults. So those butterflies, when they're in their butterfly form, their adult form, can nectar on lots of different plants, and echinacea is really good for them. But you also need to have the right host plant for their caterpillars to continue to have all those butterflies nectaring on your echinacea. So it's kind of that two-part thing. Alan, yeah.
A lot of us have food gardens, and in fact, I've been planting pea seeds this week. How well do those work for our pollinators? I mean, are there some foods that are more favorable? I mean, we're all growing tomato plants and bean plants, and do you have any advice there?
Yeah. Um, so I think we might actually be having a design in our design portfolio for like in garden beneficial insect attractor strips. But to your question, most of our food plants are not native. They're tropical annuals or they're European species, and that's fine. You know, they can sometimes serve, like I was saying, the echinacea, they can serve as a nectar or pollen source for generalists, which also deserve to be supported. There is a specialist bee on squash. So if you have any cucurbits in your garden, you're supporting, I think it's Peponapis pruinosa. I would have to look at it, but it is actually one of the declining bees on our list. And there are some native cucurbits that it's adapted to, but it can also use the pollen on your squash plants in your garden. In general, you know, we have like I grow corn, it's wind pollinated. There's some debate about whether or not insects actually use corn pollen or pollen of other wind pollinated plants, but overall, flowers are going to be better. My main thing I would say is that if you're going to add flowers to your vegetable garden, skip, and this is kind of heretical, but like don't worry too much about the zinnias and the cosmos unless you really love them, in which case absolutely grow them. But don't grow those garden annuals specifically for pollinators. Just go straight to the native perennials. And you can have a lovely border in your garden or some permanent beds that have those flowering perennials. And that will hopefully attract insects that will then also help to pollinate your crops.
All right,
Yeah.
thank you.
Hey, Maya.
Maya, yeah.
Hi. Thank you, Avalon, for your talk. I really got a lot out of it. And I appreciate the giving the whole picture with lots of resources and information. Um, my question was about more about like site prep and my one the bane of my existence. I'm a landscape designer, and the one thing that really bothers me about site prep, especially in a large area, is the use of herbicides. And I looked on your website and looked at the case studies, and I noticed that 3 out of the 5 used herbicides. Now, how do you think that, being that this ban is going to take place, how do you think you may now like pivot and get around using herbicides? And how do you think that will affect installation and projects and management and stuff?
Yeah, good question. Tough question. So the ban is not an herbicide ban, it's a pesticide ban. So that's two different chemical classes. The neonics that are going to be banned are not related to the herbicide that um, was used in those
Oh,
case study sites. And that herbicide is glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in Roundup. So Roundup itself, like I'm not a fan of herbicide. I will always go to herbicides last. But the case studies that decided to use them specifically in, I think, a couple of cases because of the presence of pernicious invasives that they felt that site tilling would have just, done more to spread those invasives while also damaging soil health and everything and not resulted in a good site prep. Or the large herbicide site prep, which was the barred meadow, was a conventional cornfield for many years and was just absolutely drenched in everything toxic that you can imagine. And so we did a survey to see like what insects were present on that site, and we found almost nothing. And we
mm,
decided to do kind of one last application there because there was mugwort, which is one of the like untillable invasives, and it was a too large of a site to do tarping. Um, so there was one more like herbicide round that was done on that site. In retrospect, I might have even said they could have gotten away without it. I'm kind of moving away from, and again, not a designer or an installer, but I think the conventional wisdom for a while with some of this stuff has been like, you absolutely have to get to a clean slate. You have to get to just pure, perfect, bare soil before you can plant into any of it. And I think we're sort of moving as a discipline toward like, let's work with what's there. Let's be a lot less chemical heavy. Let's see what we can do with like changing mowing timing, stewarding what native plants might want to come out of a seed bank when we stop aggressively mowing forever. Um, yeah, so I can't come down hard and say no herbicides ever because it's just such a common tool in the trade right now. But I hope as a trade we're moving away from it. And I will also, I think I started saying this and got distracted myself. Glyphosate is the active ingredient in Roundup. Roundup itself is directly toxic to bees. So if anybody is ever thinking about, and probably nobody here is, but if you are ever involved in a project that does want to use herbicide to do site prep, you have to get a licensed applicator and they have to not use the Roundup brand because the surfactants and the other chemicals in that mix are almost as bad as some of the actual like insect targeted pesticides. So it's like, it's a tool of last resort and it's really just a response, I think, to the sites that have like the worst invasive problems. I don't know. How does that answer your question?
that was a great answer. And one thing I just attended a symposium like a few weeks ago, and one of the speakers was highlighting a few native plants that actually outcompete. I mean, she had things
Mhm.
like knotweed that I was like, what? Like, I want to hear more
Yeah.
about, how she's using native plants to outcompete knotweed. And um, also mugwort and things like that. So these are things that I definitely scribbled on my notepad to try. But
Yeah,
yeah, I mean, uh, I
pretty cool.
don't use herbicide, and I try really hard with the manual labor, just trying to get things out or cutting things back, and trying to starve it and all these different techniques. But it drives the cost up
Yeah, that's the other
significantly.
thing. Yeah. The natives outcompeting invasives is really exciting and something that, yeah, I didn't have time to get deep into in this talk, but I'm really glad you brought it up. And it's definitely a thing. And if anybody's curious, or I'm sure you can share more as well, but some of the native grasses that I was mentioning, some of the especially the warm season bunch grasses, like your big blue stems, your switchgrass. There's one other that I always forget in that kind of trifecta, are doing a really good job of outcompeting mugwort right now at the native meadow trials at the Hudson Valley Farm Hub, which is a really amazing like native um, planting kind of pilot zone. And I really, really hope that more research goes in that direction, the like what natives can outcompete invasives. Um, it's also a deer effect, whether or not natives can outcompete invasives. Because if you have your natives and your invasives next to each other, the deer are going to target the native and set it back and set it back and release the invasive to do its crazy invasive stuff. So if you have lower deer pressure, the native plants are going to do a lot better job at outcompeting invasive plant pressure. That's what I would say about that. Let's see. Do we have
Tamara?
Tamara?
Um, so for different vegetables like corn and gourds, like different vegetables that they are from New York originally, but they're kind of popular. What do you think of them now? Because when I feel like intuitively I would think that when you go to the store and you buy seeds for them, since they're so kind of modified, then they're not the same. But what do you think of those? Like, do you think that they're kind of quote unquote native plants still?
That's a really good question and sort of out of my wheelhouse. Um, I understand, and other better vegetable gardeners can jump in on this, that there are such things as like beans that were lost in a cave for 5,000 years and then were able to be propagated. And so we have those really old genetics. We certainly have some like ancestral indigenous corn lineages. I think there was a project at actually at the same Hudson Valley Farm Hub that did a lot of like seed rematriation work. And there's other organizations like the Alliance of Native Seed Keepers, and then within indigenous communities as well. I think a lot of the seeds are being, the seed lines are still being conserved. Whether we think of indigenous crops as native plants is a really interesting question that I'm not qualified to comment on at all. But they're, you know, it's kind of interesting because these are plants that were bred by humans to, serve a crop function. Like we know corn is, I think we think that corn would disappear from the planet within like 5 years if people weren't saving the seeds from it or something, because it needs to be propagated like in an agricultural setting. So a lot of times those types of plants, what I'm saying is don't get lumped into the like native plant bucket, but I think you're right, they probably should. I don't know though, like which exact varieties might be the closest to what was here before European arrival or where to find them. But if anyone else does, definitely chime in.
You were talking about mulch.
Mhm.
When you first plant a garden, those plants are not the size that they're going to be. You need mulch for that point, right? Shredded bark.
Depends on who you ask. I don't know. I have done it both ways. And it depends on who's doing the labor, how much labor they want to put in, and also what size plants you're putting in. So if you're doing a brand new garden, I know a lot of installers that will lay down like an inch or two of mulch and then first, like on the bare soil, and then do plugs into that. And then just let that mulch decompose and never replenish it. If you're doing gallon plants and then you're planting like a really good matrix in between them of Pennsylvania sedge or something else, I don't know if you need it. I know somebody who is like a fervent proponent of the stirrup hoe. He won't mulch anything. He will only hoe around his young new native plantings. He says that as soon as you put mulch down, you're setting yourself up for hand weeding, and he just doesn't want to deal with it, so he just hoes. There's also the question of do you need mulch to trap water that first year? Well, some people would say yes. Other people would say mulch can actually prevent like small amounts of rainfall from reaching plant roots because it's just absorbed right there in the mulch layer. So maybe mulch is actually like a water hog. I don't know like exactly where I would say. My slide about less mulching was more about like let's not be replenishing deep mulch on our gardens once they're established. But even this question of like what should we do with a baby garden is sort of open to interpretation as I understand it. But other landscape designers are welcome to share their experiences too. Or landscape designers. I am not a landscape designer.
Avalon is Matt Kovner. I'm not sure my name is showing up, but I just wanted to say that this is a fantastic talk, so enjoyable and so interesting. And I'm with the Olive Conservation Advisory Council, and I know that you're involved with the Olive Library Project. Is that right?
Yes. Are they a grantee? I know that I'm going to the Olive Free Library to give this talk or a very similar
Yeah.
talk, I think next week. So maybe I will see some of you there and we can talk more.
They're trying to get a grant, but they didn't do it yet. But
Okay.
this is so helpful. If you can keep doing these talks, we really appreciate it. And it is really something that is fascinating to all of us Hudson Valley types who are growing and trying to solve these climate problems locally.
Thank you so much. That's great to hear. I really appreciate it.
Great. Well, with that, we're done. Will you come back and give a talk about meadows?
Sure.
I had a question that I put in the chat.
And you want to ask your question, Ann?
Yeah, I just want to know, do you know what these little brown moths are that are appearing? I have
You're the
Uh,
second person to ask me, and I haven't seen them, so I don't know. I'm also a plant person more so than a pollinator person. Sorry. I don't know the moth answer. They're not
okay.
spongy moths. We're definitely not into spongy moth season yet.
I have a fast question. I've tried a lot of different native plants, of which a fair number have failed. Does your list sort of talk about which plants are easier to establish and which are? Ragweed ragweed does very well in my yard. But
Ragweed's native, but it's wind pollinated, so it's not a pollinator plant.
I know, but I'm just trying to.
Oh, so if ragweed likes it there, what else will like it there?
Well, I've got various areas in my yard.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that made me happiest is I found Dutchman's briefs growing in
That's
my yard. But I mean, I'd like to bring back more of the native plants, but I tried Trillium, and where I put it, they failed to come back, and so.
Did they fail to come back, or did the deer eat them?
Well, that's true. I do get the deer visiting my yard.
Trillium are like the candy of the creme de la creme for deer.
So funny.
So when you say, yeah, so the short answer to your question is no. I'm sorry. Unfortunately, the list is not necessarily sorted by easy to propagate. However, the designs that are coming out are going to be including a selection, like all the plants within the design are assumed to be, home gardener friendly. Whether that means like foolproof, I can't say because again, every situation and every yard is different. Everybody's water, soil type, deer pressure, everything. the question of why does a plant succeed or fail is a whole other hour and change, probably. I'll just add that another thing I'm hoping to add to Pollinate HV, and I've started it, is a list, like a network of native landscapers who are able to come out and help you troubleshoot those types of questions. Maya, I actually noticed your talk on the Third Thursday YouTube, and I was hoping to add you to that list. If you're willing, I can shoot you an email about it. But if anybody else is involved in like land stewardship and is a, professionally and would like to be referred out to clients such as Alan who need their plants to survive better, then feel free to contact me and I'll happily add you to the list.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, not that I'm, you have to pay someone to figure this out for you, but for those who are for professional assistance, that's something I want to add to Pollinate HV. That's just a tangent off of your question.
Great, thanks a lot, Avalon. We're gonna have to go. We're out of time. But thank you so much, Eric. Thanks for everybody for showing up, and thanks, Avalon, for giving a great presentation.
Thank you so much, everyone. It was so nice to be with you all, and yeah, maybe be back for Meadows one day.